Fixing to go to number 3.
Number 3. Lib is with her brand new, oh no, you're writing.
Yeah, I'm writing. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But Lib has a brand new iPad. She's able to communicate with the world now. And, so we're happy for her.
We're all in trouble.
That's right.
Yeah,
Well, this brings us to our third perspective, and it's probably time in this study that we try to define exactly what evil is. We've been talking about evil and pain and suffering, but I think it's time that we try to define what evil actually is. And so it brings us to our third perspective, and we're going to take a look at that. And so our third perspective is to try to understand that evil is not something that has an existence all of its own. Rather, evil is a corruption of something good that already exists. Now, I know that may sound a little confusing. What does that mean? I think I can show you as we go through this, so hang in there. Don't leave because you might be confused with this. I think we can get you through this. Now, you may say from this, well, isn't it pretty obvious that what evil is? Evil is bad. Evil is bad things. We've got to try to understand it from a little deeper perspective. It's true, we do tend to think of evil as bad, but it raises the question of what do we mean by bad? When you use the word bad, it implies that you have an idea of what's good. Or if you claim something to be good, then you're implying that you have an idea of what is bad. And we're going to get into that and look more at that more deeply as we go through this. But in the meantime, we need to start by trying to define evil and try to understand exactly what it is that evil is. And I'm going to teach this to you through the understanding of two of our greatest church leaders and theologians from quite some time ago. One from medieval period of time, Thomas Aquinas, and one back to the 5th century, St. Augustine. And Aquinas and Augustine both agree on the understanding of what evil actually is. And so we'll look at their definitions and their understanding, and then we'll try to simplify it so that we can all understand what these great minds are really talking about. Well, they would hold that evil is the absence or the privation of something good. Now, bear with me on this, and I think we can understand this as we start to bring it all together. Here's our two gentlemen that we're going to use. St. Augustine, he lived during a period of time up until about 430 A.D. He was known as a father of the church. He was a philosopher. He was a theologian. And most doctrine of the church today finds its basis from an understanding given to us by St. Augustine. Likewise, in medieval period of time, along comes another hugely brilliant philosopher and theologian by the name of St. Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas lived during the medieval period of time. He was referred to as a doctor of the church because he was smart. He was just smart. And but both of these guys held to the same understanding of what evil is. And so we're going to try to dissect that and use their definition. I don't want to bring you my definition. I want to bring it to you straight from these brilliant minds of the church, doctors of the church. And they reasoned logically to what evil is, and I'll try to show you how they did that. I put a note up here regarding Manichaeism. I'll throw a big word out at you. Manichaeism is a heretical teaching that came about in the very early centuries. Remember from church, from our worldviews, when I got into Catholicism, I taught some of the history of the church. And early on in the church fathers had to defend against false doctrines and heretical teachings. And one of those false teachings that they had to defend against and take a stand against was something called Manichaeism. And Manichaeism tried to put a perspective on evil in this fashion. Manichaeism claimed that there were two forces at work, two realms. One realm was a realm of goodness, and one realm was a realm of evil. And these two forces were constantly battling with each other. There was the goodness realm, or the good realm, was a spiritual realm, and the evil realm was a material realm. Anything that was matter, any matter, human beings were made up of material matter. That was thought to be and taught to be by Manichaeism evil. Only the spiritual was good, and these two forces were constantly at odds. Not too much different than the Gnostics, who taught similar things during the second and the third centuries. And the Gnostics believed that they held a higher knowledge, a greater knowledge, a secret knowledge that others didn't have. But part of that knowledge was based on the same teachings of Manichaeism, that there are two forces at work in the universe, one being a spiritual force of goodness and one being a material force of evil, and they fought with each other. Well, our doctors of the church, our church fathers, had to take a stand against these false teachings. And so this is just one of many that they had to take a stand against. So along comes Thomas Aquinas, first along comes St. Augustine, to try to define what exactly evil is, to take a stand against this heretical teaching called Manichaeism. Well, here's Augustine, considered the doctor of the church, and a huge background on him, but we won't take the time to go through it. Just take my word for it. He was a brilliant man, and a lot of writings today and doctrinal understandings come from the teachings of this wise doctor of the church and philosopher. And so take my word for it. He was brilliant, and so we won't spend time on this. But he defined evil like this. He has a syllogism on evil. He says, God is the creator of all beings. What he's trying to do is logically reason to what evil is. So he starts this way. He says, God is the creator of all being. Okay, and we believe that. We believe that God created all things, right? Colossians 1:16. That God created all things. Everything God creates is good. The perfect, absolute perfection can only create that which is good. God is incapable of creating anything that is evil or bad, if you want to use that word. The perfect God cannot create evil or badness. And so Augustine reasons God is a creator of all things. God cannot create anything except goodness. And so hence everything that exists is good. Well, we know today not all things are good. We've got bad in the world. We've got evil. We've got pain and suffering, which we will call bad. And so the question is, how do these guys respond to this? This is a fact. God is the creator of all things. This is a fact. Everything God creates is good. It has to be. And this is a fact, that everything that exists is therefore good. So how do we deal with it? Well, they define it this way, that corruption or evil exists not on its own, not as an essence of its own. It doesn't exist by itself. But it exists rather in some substance in which is corrupted. And so I'll give you an example down here. We'll look at a lot more examples. For example, rust doesn't exist in itself, but only when that metal, that good metal, has been corrupted does rust exist. And so we're going to look and try to understand this. I'm going to try to give you many examples and try to break this down so you can understand what is meant when they say evil doesn't have an essence of its own, but rather evil is just a corruption or a privation of something that is good. And it reasons because God created all things. all things that God creates is good. Yet we've got evil. We recognize evil. If God created all things, and all things that God creates is good, from whence cometh evil? Valid question. So we can reason that evil must be this privation or this corruption of something that is good, because everything began as good. Where did it go wrong? Well, we're going to explore that when down the road. And we'll look at that. If God created everything that was very good, perfect, then how did things go wrong if there was nothing but perfection? And we'll talk about that. We'll understand that down the road. But understand, first of all, that God created everything, that everything God created was good. So from whence cometh evil? Well, evil must be a privation, a corruption of what God created. And that's where we're headed with this, okay? Makes sense so far? I know it's a little bit out there, but Thomas Aquinas comes along in the medieval period of time, in the 13th century, and he agrees. He said, yeah, that's right. And again, it reasons to it. It must be right, because if God created all things, and God cannot create anything except goodness, then evil must be a corruption of that goodness, right? Otherwise, God must have introduced evil. And God, as the perfect God, can simply not do that. He's not capable of doing that. He can only produce that which is good. So from whence cometh evil? Well, we can only surmise in that it's a corruption of something good that God created. And we'll explore this as we go looking at this perspective, and I think you'll see it more clearly. He says evil involves the absence of something good that ought to be there. And when good that should be in something is not in that something, then the result is evil. Evil is simply the word we use to describe the absence of good. So evil is an absence of good because, again, God created all things. And so that being the case, then evil logically reasons that it must be the absence of good. The word ought implies should. And so something good that should be there. It implies something that's understood that should exist, that should be there. Well, there's an interesting book. It's called Orthodox Dogmatic Theology, written by a guy by the name of Michael Pomanatsky. And he writes this to help try to explain what Aquinas is, or what Augustine is saying here. He says the Holy Fathers indicate that evil is not some kind of essence which has any actual independent existence, like the elements and powers of the world which were created by God. Evil is only a deviation of living beings from that original condition in which the Creator placed them, into a condition which is opposed to this. Therefore, it is not God who is the cause of moral evil. Rather, it proceeds from creatures themselves, for they have deviated from the agreement of their will with the will of God. The essence of evil consists in the violation of God's will, the commandments of God, and the moral law which is written in the human conscience. This violation is called sin. So he's trying to put another spin on this to try to explain what St. Augustine is saying here. And then, as I said, many hundreds of years later, along comes Thomas Aquinas, agreeing with Augustine on this issue and trying to explain this. Well, the early church fathers understood this. They understood what evil is. And they understood it, I think, primarily because it logically reasons. It logically reasons because if God created all things, as we believe, as the Bible says, and all God can create is good, then it just simply reasons from that evil must be a corruption of that which God created. Because God created all things. Okay? So, makes sense so far? Okay, I'm not seeing many confused faces, so that's good. We're going to work on this more as we go through this. Look at some examples And then I want you to listen to R.C. Sproul speak about this. I don't know that we're going to see him tonight because it's about a 20-minute clip, but he explains what I'm going to be explaining to you. So anyway, let's look at some examples of this. Well, rot is a good example. Rot only exists as long as the tree or the wood that was once good exists. That's the only reason we have rot, is because this good wood has been corrupted. And rot exists because of that corruption. Well, this is sort of an ugly picture, I know. Yeah, sorry about that.
Wow.
I love it. I hate to be a dentist.
That's your dark side.
You can look away, and I'll just tell you, tooth decay exists as long as the tooth that was once good exists. When it's corrupted, that good tooth.
They still take care of it.
Yeah. So we'll move to something else. I know that's ugly. Here's our rust example. Rust exists as long as only exists as long as the metal that was once good exists. Well, that's probably ugly too, but not as bad as a teeth, I think. But a wound is the same thing. A wound in the tissue of the body exists as long as the tissue, which was once good tissue, exists. It was good tissue. It's been corrupted, and now evil exists, or bad exists upon that. The same is true for moth holes. Moth holes in a garment, well, they exist as long as the garment, which was once good, exists. Otherwise, if that garment is destroyed and goes away, then these moth holes don't exist any longer. They exist only when that good cloth, that good garment, has been violated, as long as it's been corrupted. Well, here's a good example of sunburn. Now, that's a bad sunburn. That's serious. Yeah. That person, I don't know who they are. That's third degree. That's bad. But sunburn exists where once good, healthy tissue existed. And so we can call this sunburn evil, we can call it bad, whatever you want to use, but it exists as evil only because the good tissue has been corrupted. Okay? It's a privation, it's a corruption of what was once good, and now it's been corrupted. So evil is not something that has an existence all of its own. Rather, evil is a corruption of a good which already exists. And again, this is not my definition. This comes from our church fathers who recognized, but they recognized it again because they reasoned to it. And that's what I want you to do in this class. I want you to open your minds up to reason and think things through. Sometimes we don't do that. We fail to logically think things through. Apologetics is a great study to understand the evidence for the existence of God. Believe it or not, we can reach the conclusion that God must exist just logically through our minds. He must exist. Something eternal absolutely has to exist, or we couldn't be here today. Now that's another study altogether, but we can logically reason that something eternal absolutely must exist, or there couldn't be something today. And so, yeah.
There's a book written by Leo Buscaglia, and the title of it is Love. He presented the world problems exist from too much love or not enough love, which is a perfect example of this.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Yeah. I've not read that, but it's interesting. Yeah. But yeah, many things we can reason to logically, but we fail sometimes to engage our minds to think these through. But I think here's one example. You can just logically reason that evil must be a privation of something good because everything that was created was good, and God created everything. Now you're going to ask, well, what went wrong? Well, we're going to get to that. We'll get to that when we get to it. Yeah. Well, how did that happen? But we'll get to that. One baby step at a time. Yeah. So, whoops, I went backwards. I didn't mean to do that. So evil is the absence or privation of something good. Said simply, taking the words of Aquinas and And Augustine, we can say it simply, evil is the absence or privation of something good. Well, here's just another example of that. Evil exists. Evil does not exist by itself because it doesn't exist apart from good. Evil exists as a corruption of some good thing, which we've been saying. It's a privation, and it doesn't have an existence of its own. Okay? There's a whale. That's been corrupted.
Chairman.
Now, this is Dr. William Dembski. Dr. Dembski is, he's a walking brain. He's maybe one of the smartest people I've ever run into, and I had the good fortune of having him as one of my professors when I took intelligent design. In fact, he is one of the foremost leaders in the country on intelligent design. And in fact, now he's one of the professors full-time at the Southern Evangelical Seminary. But this is Dr. Dembski, and he says the same thing, that evil exists as a corruption of something good. It exists only in something else, not in itself. And so he explains it this way. He said, evil always parasites good. Indeed, all our words for evil presupposes a good that has been perverted. Impurities presuppose purity, unrighteousness presupposes righteousness, deviation presupposes a way from which we've departed. Sin presupposes a target that was missed, and so on. And so here he is in the 21st century, getting away from Augustine and Aquinas, bringing it to the 21st century, a man equally as smart, it seems, as Augustine and Aquinas, and agreeing with the same thing, that evil is a privation of something that was once good. Evil is a corruption of something that was once good. And so that fits our definition and understanding of what evil is as we try to understand this. Well, I made this slide. I don't even remember what I put up here, but think of it this way. Jesus said he's the light of the world. Right? We remember that passage. Jesus said he's the light of the world. It's interesting that darkness can't take away the light, but the light can consume the darkness. You know, you think about that. You go into your bedroom at night and it's totally dark, and you flip on the light and darkness is just overcome with light. But you can't have the light on and turn on the darkness and the light go away. The light always overcomes the dark. And the Bible says that Jesus is the light.
Amen.
Wow, how encouraging is that? You know, nothing can consume and overtake Christ because he's the light of the world. God is light, and so light is good, right? But darkness is the absence of light, the privation of light. You know, men do their evil deeds in the dark, right? And so darkness is just simply the absence of that which is good. And here's a passage on the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. But you knew that passage. And so we find it interesting, again, that Jesus is the light of the world, and so darkness cannot overtake Christ at all. Well, here's some more examples. Sickness is the absence of healthy. Healthy is good, sickness is bad. And so sickness is a privation of that which is good. Healthy is good. But sickness is a privation of that healthiness, that goodness, if you will. And death is the absence or the privation of life. Life is good. But death is the privation of life. And so maybe those examples help you. Well, let me see. We might have a chance to listen to the first. I want you to hear, R.C. Sproul is a renowned 21st century theologian, a very brilliant man. I don't hold to all of his beliefs. He's a bit of too Calvinistic for me, but that's okay. Very smart man, but he addresses this in two different clips that I'll think I'll show you. Yeah, I think I'll show you this first one and let you listen to him since we're on this subject.
Of the questions is, what is evil? The second question is, where did it come from? But the first part of the question is, what is evil? And my immediate response to that in presidential fashion is to say, it depends upon what the meaning of is. Now, that's really not a joke. I'm serious about that because there are different ways in which we use the verb is as a verb to be. And when we're dealing with the question of what is evil, we face immediately the issue of whether evil really is at all. Now, that might seem strange to you, but my first assertion this morning is that evil isn't. That is, it is not. Why? Because evil is nothing. Am I going too fast? Evil is nothing. Now, lest you think that I've fallen into Christian Science, a religion that's neither Christian nor science, where the reality of evil is denied altogether and considered to be an illusion, I want to clarify what I mean when I say evil is not, or that evil is nothing. Before I do that, let me tell you a story of an occasion where I was asked to debate a spokesperson for Christian Science on this question of the nature of evil. And the position of my opponent that day was that evil is an illusion. And so in the course of that discussion, I asked him a question. Did he think that I was an illusion? Was I a fig Newton of his imagination? And he declared that he did not think that I was an illusion. He considered that I was real. And I said, well, we're really having this discussion here, and I am saying that evil is not an illusion, and you are saying that it is an illusion. And my simple question is this: do you think it's good that I am saying that evil is not an illusion? He said, no. I said, well, if it's not good that I'm saying that, it must be bad. And so here's one example of an evil that is not an illusion. And it sort of went downhill after that. But what do I mean when I say that evil is nothing? What I mean by that is I'm taking the word nothing and resting upon its etymological derivation, where the term nothing comes from the combination of a negative prefix and a subject. And the word nothing really means no thing. And the reason I want to stress that point is so that in the culture we get the idea that evil is some kind of independent substance. Something that is in your drinking water or in the clouds somewhere. Some force or power that is independent, that exists in and of himself and influences the affairs of your life and of this world. And so the first thing we have to say about what evil is what it is not. It is not a thing that has existence. Evil has no being. It has no ontological status. Rather, evil is an action of something that is a thing. I am something, you are something, and when I do something that is not good, then I am doing something that is evil. But evil then is an activity of some being. It has no being itself. Now that may seem like a pedantic point and of no immediate concern to the second question of where evil comes from, but later on, God willing, I'll try to indicate why our definition of evil is so important to the deeper question of where it comes from. Now, back to the idea of its nothingness. Historically, the two great theologian philosophers in the history of the church who have addressed the question of what is evil were, of course, Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine before him. And both Augustine and Aquinas used two Latin words, of course, because you can't do theology without using Latin words. And they used two Latin words to describe the nature of evil. And those two words were negatio and privatio. And you can guess the translation of those two Latin words. Privatio comes into the English language with the word privation, and negatio comes into the English language with the word negation. And so, historically and classically, the nature of evil has been defined in terms of negation and privation. In philosophy and in theology, one of the most important ways in which we try to give definitions to things that are mysterious is by using the method called the way of negation. And that method talks in terms of what something is not. For example, when we talk about the character and the being of God, we say that God is infinite. What does that mean? Well, that means He is not finite. That's an application of this way of negation. And so, what Augustine and Aquinas were getting at is that to discuss the nature of evil, which the Bible calls the mystery of...
Now, that may have whet your appetite to hear the rest of it, and we'll do that next week because we're really out of time. But anyway, I wanted you to hear from someone else besides me as to a definition of what evil is, because that's going to help to set the stage for us in the weeks ahead as we continue to try to understand pain and suffering and evil in the world. If we're going to talk about why is there evil in the world, I think the first place to start is to define what is evil. And so that's why we take that up tonight. Yes, Chris?
Tom, in the Bible it says that we fight against the principalities. What does that mean?
The principalities.
Isn't that good and evil?
Yeah, talking about those sources, those things that make up the darkness that passage refers to. Spiritual forces in heavenly places, referring to the darker spiritual forces, evil, and
so it is physical. I mean, it's spiritual, but I mean, it is a realm.
I'm not.
Evil is
a thing. Because he said that it wasn't.
Yeah.
R.C. Sproul said
Right,
that it wasn't.
it's not, it's a privation. And if you trace those principalities back, where do you end up? You end up with Satan. And so now you're back to looking at the source of that evil. Well, so where do we get it being a privation? Because we started with God's creation of even the angels that were perfect and good. But we know that the angels fell. There was in that goodness within Lucifer and 1/3 of the angels that fell, there was a privation of that goodness. And from that we get other evil. We get spiritual demons and sources. But if you trace them back, you're going to trace them all the way back to God creating those angels. And when God created, they were good. But what went wrong, well, we've got to explore that and see. But that's where the privation comes in. So if you just simply walk it back to where that evil comes from and say, well, that's a realm, that is something. Well, it's not. It's a privation of that which was good. And the angels that God created were good, just like man. And so now we've got to try to figure out, well, then what went wrong? How was that good privated? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
So originally it wasn't a thing. I mean, what you're saying is originally it was the privation of good.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
I
It started as good because
Yeah.
God can only create that which is good, and God created the angels,
Yeah,
and so they started as good.
right.
And so the privation that occurred to those good angels
Right,
is where evil stems from. It's a privation of that
right.
goodness.
It was not a tangible thing, but then things became evil, like Satan and the angels. And
Yeah.
that's where you get the things that are evil, but originally it was not.
Yeah, when you trace it back,
Okay.
they come from a privation of what was once good.
Okay.
Now, we still have to address the question of,
So that's why we can't blame the devil. The devil made it do it.
well, yeah, we've got to go back to trace that back again to see, well, where did it all go wrong then? How did that
Yeah.
privation creep in? And we're going to do that, but we're going to build up to that. So-
In my notes I wrote down, evil is an action of something. When it becomes an action, does it place it in a different realm?
You're asking the question?
Yeah, when it becomes an action, does that place the evil in a different realm?
Well, we tend to classify it under the realm or the heading or classification, whatever you want to call it, as evil.
Right.
But we've got to remember that if we trace it back to its source, then what we're going to find is that it began as something good, and then it was corrupted. Now, again, that doesn't answer the question of, well, how did it get corrupted? We'll have to deal with that. But if you trace it back, you trace it back to goodness. Because, again, just logically, we trace it back and say, well, God created everything. That doesn't mean just mankind and this earth. He created the angels also. And everything He created was good. So if we trace it back far enough, we're going to find that it began as something good. And then it became corrupted. And now we take that evil and put it under the classification of bad or whatever you want to classify it as. We call it evil.
Do you explain how evil, everything was good, even in heaven, how evil got there with God there?
Yeah, we've got to do that.
Yeah.
We have to do that. I mean, that's really the crux of our study, because that prompts the big question: of how did it happen? You know, there's a good passage to think about, and that is in Genesis. You know, the question arises: well, why did God stick the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden to begin with? If that wasn't there, then maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. And so that prompts a good question. Why did God stick that there to begin with? You know, to tempt man? Is that why He did it, to tempt man?
Well, he already knew.
Pardon?
He already knew.
Of course He knew, but why would He do that? Why would He stick it there? Of course He knew. He knew what was going to happen, and He knew how to to resolve it all. But why would he do that? Why did he stick that tree there?
It's almost like chicken and egg, right? Choice.
And so we're gonna answer that question.
Men are
Like the
such.
chicken. Like the chicken and the egg, which one?
Maybe God, if he'd have just made woman, we'd have been okay. Yeah. So yeah, we got to get into those questions for sure, and we will. I promise you. But my seminary class is just getting ready to start into the real meat of it, but we're not quite there yet. Anything else?
I can't believe it's time to go. This
I
has been
couldn't,
so
they got
fast.
what in the world?
That goes by pretty quick, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Man.
Tina, you with us?
Yes, I'm with you.
All right, we're glad you're
Yes,
here.
I love it. Yes,
Good.
thank you.
Good.
Okay.
Okay, we'll start over. So we're going to finish last week's class, which will wrap up this third perspective that we're looking at. And we were right in the middle of a little lecture from R.C. Sproul, a theologian who understands very clearly those things that our early church fathers, Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, taught about what evil is. This was our perspective that we were looking at, and that evil is not something that has an existence of its own, but rather evil is a corruption of something good that already exists. Remember that from last week, and we'll go over that some more tonight before we jump to our fourth perspective. So we'll jump into that, the rest of his lecture. I'm going to cut it not short, but he goes into another area of topic on his lecture. So when I cut it off, it's just because he ends this subject of what evil is. So anyway, we'll jump into that, and then we'll try to wrap up this perspective then. Oh, and I just said evil is the absence or privation of something good. You already know that. And we'll just add to that by what Dr. Sproul has to teach us tonight.
We have to first understand it by way of negation, by what it is not. Now, evil in this sense can only be defined against the backdrop of what is good. And in biblical terms, evil is defined by words like this: ungodliness, unrighteousness, injustice, for example. So that the term is used as the negation, the opposite of the positive thing that's being affirmed. So that injustice or unjustness, it can only be understood against the previous concept of justice. Unrighteousness can only be recognized as unrighteousness against the background of righteousness as the standard by which unrighteousness can be recognized and can be defined. I think that's pretty easy to see, that the way in which negative language is used to describe evil. In this sense, the great theologians would indicate that evil is parasitic. It's like a parasite. It can't be known in and of itself as some independent being, but can only be known and understood against the positive standard. And like a parasite, if the host dies, the parasite dies with it, because the parasite depends upon the host for its own strength and existence. And in like manner, and then analogical way, the same thing is true of evil, is that you can't really describe it, you can't really define it, except against the background of the good. Now, the other word that is used by Augustine and Aquinas is the word privation. And what a privation is some sort of lack or some sort of deficiency. If you don't get something that you want, that doesn't mean that you're experiencing deprivation, but if you don't get something that you need, then it can be properly said that you have been deprived, that you are lacking something that is necessary and essential to your very being. If we go to the Westminster Confession of Faith, the 17th century Reformed confession, and its catechetical formulations in the Westminster Larger Catechism, and then in the Shorter Catechism, you have the simple question that is asked, what is sin? What is sin? And since you all know the Catechism, you know the answer to that before I give it. What is sin? Sin is any want of conformity to or transgression of the law of God. So there, confessionally, sin or moral evil is defined in terms of a lack, of a privation, of a want of conformity to. Righteousness involves conforming to the law of God, doing what God commands. But sin enters in when we fail to do what God commands and we fail to conform to his standards of what is righteous. And so on the one hand, the Catechism says that sin is a want of conformity to, which is a kind of provatio, a kind of privation, or transgression of the law of God. Now, we're moving out of simple privation and simple negation to another element. An element that the reformers of the 16th century added to the classic definition of evil. They agreed that evil is negation and is privation, but lest anyone should think that because evil has no being, no independent status, is not a thing, unless because of that we come to the conclusion that evil really is an illusion. The reformers said that yes, sin is negation, or evil is negation, evil is privation, but they added another Latin term, don't they always? They added the term actuosa. That is to say, evil is provatio actuosa, meaning that though evil is not something that exists in and of itself, it is real, and its effects and its impact are devastating. There is an actual privation, that is an activated privation, an activated disobedience to the Word of God. And because real beings act out real evil, though evil is not independent, nevertheless it is real. Am I making sense? Are you getting that? You understanding that point? So is it too obscure? Of course not. You all get it, don't you? So that's where we start with this question of what is evil and where does it come from?
Now, we stop there because he's going to take a different question, a little different path. But I just wanted you to hear from him confirming what we've been learning last week, this very same thing that our earliest church fathers, probably our wisest, most educated church fathers, people like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, they taught this very understanding of this doctrine of evil. Well, I thought I'd try to put it in a perspective for us so that we can try to follow this again. We read in Colossians, Paul writes that God created all things, and in 1 Timothy that all things that were created good. And that's going to lead us to a passage probably next week we're going to look at in the book of Genesis in chapter 1. We'll save that, I think, for next week. But if God created all things and God is incapable of creating anything except good, then we can reason from that logically that evil can only exist as some kind of a corruption of some good thing. Again, if God created all things and everything God created is good, then it can only be that evil must be a privation, a corruption of that good. Makes sense to you? So we can just logically sort of reason to this. And so therefore we get the end of our syllogism, the therefore, we get the premises, and now we get the conclusion. Therefore, evil has to be a privation of something that is good. And it just makes sense. God created all things. All things God created was good. So the only way we can describe evil is it must be a privation or a corruption. Okay with that? Well, I've got a little shorter definition, but it really is saying the same thing that R.C. Sproul just said when he gave you a definition of sin. I'm just going to shorten it, but it says the same thing. Sin is disobedience to God. Any disobedience to God is sin. So we need to be sure that we sort of understand this, because this is going to play a role in other things as we go through this. Evil is the resulting acts of sin, the decay or absence of something good. All that God created is good. God created all things, and so it's the decaying of something that God created that is evil, that we can define as evil. And this comes about primarily, not, I'm not going to get into that. This comes about from man's disobedience to God, or its resulting acts of sinful man. Okay? So pain and suffering comes about as a result of evil acts of man. So we have sin, disobedience from God. From sin comes evil, and from evil comes acts that cause pain and suffering. Make sense in that respect to you? So we can, again, sort of logically walk this thing down. And if we simply state it, if man were completely obedient to God, then there'd be no evil in the world. There'd be no sin, and then there'd be no evil, and if no evil, no pain and suffering. So from that we can conclude how to get rid of pain and suffering in the world. If man were completely obedient to God, we could eliminate pain and suffering, and we wouldn't be having this class tonight, because we wouldn't have a subject to deal with.
Are you saying pain and suffering of the soul or pain and suffering of the body?
Well, we're gonna have to deal with that, because we've got to look at pain and suffering not only physically, and not only emotionally, and not only man's involvement in pain and suffering, but we've also got to look at it from the aspect of, well, what about other things that bring upon pain and suffering, such as nature? How do we account for that? Hurricanes, tornadoes, and those types of things that also cause pain and suffering. Man didn't cause that, so how do we explain it? Well, we are going to explain it, but we're going to do it later. We're going to say that for probably near the end. So don't think we're going to skip over anything. I think I've got all the bases covered in this class. But anyways, that's a good question, and we will get to it. We've got to address that some. But now you can take this, and I have been able to, what I believe is logically reason that everything stems back to man. And man's use of free will, which we're going to start talking about in our next perspective, man's use of free will to satisfy himself. Man, we're going to talk about this, but man, we're going to see, has settled for a lesser good. God desires a greater good for us. But man's willingness to accept a lesser good, because we want it now and we want it for ourselves, we're going to find plays a huge role in understanding pain and suffering. But I think what we deal with today amongst mankind is this all about me attitude. Today we can see it. Life has become all about me. I tell people from time to time it's frightening, but it's become almost a dog-eat-dog world. People will step on anything or anybody to get ahead, or to put goodness in their life, or to get away from their own pain and suffering. If they cause your pain and suffering along the way, if they can take it away from them, that's the society that we've evolved into. It's become this idea that it's everything is about me. It's all about me. Let me show you what I mean. That this society, we've reached a point. I think it's gone too far. This all about me has gone just a little bit too far.
Yeah.
Let me show you what I mean when I say in today's world, life has truly become all about me.
It's all about me. Really.
It is all about you. Now, the greatest collection of me worship ever assembled on one CD.
It's all about now I lift my name on high.
All 20 songs, all about you.
My praises. I exalt thee.
This amazing collection is great to share with friends, if you have any. Everyone can join in the worship with you, for you, and about you. Because you are unique, and you love you.
There is none like me. No one else.
All this for only $19.95. Operators are standing by to serve you.
And I am why I sing, and I am why I live.
If you order now, you'll also receive a second CD of Yuletide favorites.
I sing, no come
Call 1-800-ME-ME-ME or order online at memyselfandI.com. Call today because no one can praise you like you.
We all know people just like that.
I love that video.
Yes, sir.
I love that video.
Yeah.
It's one of the funniest things I think I've ever seen. I was at a Billy Graham thing one time that I had to take when I was in seminary, and they played that, and I went up afterwards. I said, I've got to have that. Where do you get it? I've got to have it. I just think it's the funniest thing I've ever seen. But the sad thing is, there's a lot of truth in it.
Yes.
Life has become about us.
Yes.
And we're focused on us. And that's why Jesus said so often, if you can deny yourself, anybody that wants to follow me must deny himself to be my follower. And we haven't learned that yet. We haven't learned to deny self. And I think we can trace all sin back to self. That desire to please self, to satisfy self. I think most all sin can be traced back to that. Well, let's take a look at what we've learned so far. This little image, this little graphic, I think really has a lot of truth into it. If you can't read it, it says, your life, God's perspective. And it's true, it is your life. It is your life. But if we could see your life, if you could see your life and live it through the eyes of God, the way God sees things, then I think we would have a dramatically different life to live. But that's why it's so important that I think we learn to train ourselves to look at things through the eyes of God. Now, we've looked at 3 different perspectives so far. We'll review them. We'll take a look at what we've learned so far. We've looked at the fact that pain is a necessary gift from God and performs a beneficial role in our lives. Remember that study? Pain is necessary. Physical pain alerts us. It's a warning sign. It alerts us to danger. And then we looked at God's greater good for us is holiness in eternity and not relieving us of pain on earth. We're going to learn later down the road that God, I'm going to use a big term with you, God is not metaphysically responsible for your happiness. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to it. Metaphysical just means supernaturally, beyond our empirical senses. But God is not metaphysically responsible for your happiness and my happiness. And we'll take a look at that later. And then thirdly, that evil is not something that has an existence all of its own, but rather that evil is a corruption of something good that already exists. Evil is the absence or the privation of something good. And so these are the 3 perspectives that we have looked at so far. Now remember some of these perspectives that we're looking at. You may think, well, that doesn't seem to deal directly with pain and suffering, but some of these perspectives are helping us to understand the nature of God better. We just simply have to get a better understanding of God's nature, who God is, if we really want to understand pain and suffering. And I may have mentioned this to you last week. I get my 2 classes because I'm teaching this same class on Monday. So maybe it was Monday night's class I mentioned. But anyway, to understand death, as I wrote my book about death, we can't grasp a true understanding of death, a paradigm of death, a model of death, until we understand more about the nature of God and who this God is that we claim to be the creator, who we claim to worship. We've got to do a better job in our studies of seeking the nature of God and who God is. And I think this class will help bring out to you many things about the nature of God that you've probably never considered before. And so, but these are the 3 things that we've looked at so far, the 3 perspectives. We've spent time trying to understand what evil actually is, and we know that it's a privation or a corruption of something good. It has to be, because God created all things, and all things God created are good. And so we've identified now what evil is, and this might sound like a simple question, but the truth is, before we can accurately label something as good or bad, we simply got to know a couple of other things first. Before we call something good or something bad, we've got to look at this from a different perspective. Let me try to show you what I mean. How do we know the difference between good and bad? Well, that's what we're going to try to take a look at next. Because when we say something is good, it implies that we have an understanding of what is bad. And when we say something is bad, it implies that understanding that we know what is good. And so consider it from this perspective. What is good to a spider is pain and suffering to a fly. Pain and suffering often depends upon the eyes that you're looking through, the perspective. And I'll try to show you what I mean. I'm not trying to say pain and suffering is not real. By no means am I implying that. But what I am saying is, I think as we go through this course, you're gonna start to take a little different look on things than you ever have before, and many of those things regard pain and suffering. We've just simply got to recognize and understand that when we look at pain and suffering in this world, that we generally are looking through the eyes of man. We need to learn to start looking at this from God's perspective before we start to make any presuppositions about what good and what bad is. And so we're going to try to identify that now and move into our next perspective, perspective 4. First, I'm going to give Kathy a chance to turn this off.